My great-aunt Margaret's will arrived unexpectedly. I barely remembered this distant relative who lived somewhere in the sticks, surrounded by woods and hills as old as time. She had never been a part of our city life. Her existence seemed more myth than reality. And now, a letter from a lawyer informed me that I, Alexander Miller, was the sole heir to her small estate, an old wooden house in the adjacent plot of land. My life in the city had recently lost its color. Work was going downhill, relationships had fallen apart, and I felt drained. The thought of escaping it all, hiding somewhere where no one knew me and where I could just be, became increasingly appealing. Margaret's estate seemed like the perfect solution. A temporary refuge, I convinced myself. I'll go, assess the condition, maybe sell it. For now, peace and quiet. The trip took most of the day. The last few dozen miles of road turned into a narrow, broken strip of asphalt that wound through dense, almost impenetrable forests. Cell service disappeared long before I saw the first sign for the tiny hamlet nestled at the foot of a hill. The hamlet looked abandoned. A few old houses, overgrown gardens, silent windows. I only met one old man sitting on a bench near a fence. When I asked about Margaret's house, he just slowly nodded towards the hill and mumbled something about old times and better left alone. His eyes were filled with unspoken sorrow or fear. The house stood on the very top of the hill, like a crown on a bald head. As I drove closer, the first thing that struck me was its age. It wasn't just old, it was very old, built, perhaps, in the century before last. The wooden walls were darkened by time and weather, the porch had sagged a bit, and the windows seemed to stare out at the world with empty sockets. A neglected garden bloomed around the house. The trees had grown wild, rose bushes forming impassable thickets. The key, left by the lawyer, was heavy and cold. The lock groaned, reluctantly yielding. I pushed the door, and it opened with a drawn-out moan, letting me into the darkness and cold that reigned inside. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of old age, dust, and something else. Something earthy and musty. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The beam of light snatched the silhouettes of furniture covered with white sheets from the darkness, giving the rooms the look of an abandoned theater. Everything was covered with a thick layer of dust. The first room turned out to be a living room with a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Further on was a dining room, a kitchen with an old wood-burning stove, and stairs leading up to the second floor, lost in the darkness. The house was much larger than it seemed from the outside. Rooms followed one after another, each with its own set of old furniture, mirrors reflecting only darkness, and a sense of oblivion. I walked around the first floor, then carefully went up to the second. There were several bedrooms, one of which must have belonged to Margaret. In it, there was an old dresser with a photograph on it, a woman with a stern, closed face. It was hard to say if it was her. Despite its age and neglect, the house didn't seem overtly creepy. Rather, it was sad, filled with a past that was slowly decaying. There was a sense of heavy energy, but I put it down to the general impression of an old, abandoned dwelling and my own fatigue. For the first night, I chose the least dusty room, which faced the backyard. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor, took out the necessary things from the car. It was dark outside. The surrounding forest was plunged into impenetrable darkness. Rain began to drizzle, tapping quietly on the roof. The first night was relatively peaceful, except for the constant crackling of old wood, the creaking of the house under gusts of wind, and the unusual silence that was occasionally broken by strange sounds from the forest, whether animals or something else. I fell into a restless sleep, having strange, fragmented dreams. The next few days I spent sorting things out and cleaning. The dust was incredible. It had settled on everything. I tried to air out the rooms, opening the old, reluctant windows. The cold, damp forest air slowly pushed out the mustiness, but didn't completely get rid of it. While cleaning, I began to notice strange things. Small things at first. I'd leave a cup on the table and find it on a shelf later. A door I was sure I had closed would be open. I put it down to my inattention, fatigue, maybe the house living its own life, old structures settling, wood expanding with moisture. One evening, as I sat in the living room, trying to read by the light of a camping lantern, there was no electricity in the house. I used a generator only to charge my phone. I heard a sound. It was a sound like someone slowly dragging something heavy across the floor upstairs. A scrape. A long, drawn-out scrape that slowly moved from one wall to another. I held my breath, straining to hear. My heart pounded faster. The wind, I told myself aloud. It's just the wind. But the sound didn't sound like wind. It was mechanical, deliberate. The scraping stopped. Absolute, ringing silence fell. I sat motionless, waiting for it to repeat, but nothing happened. Only the rain continued to rustle outside the window. I felt uncomfortable. I felt like I wasn't alone in this house. It wasn't just a feeling of presence, but a feeling of being watched. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it, continued reading, but it was hard to concentrate. Every shadow outside the lantern's circle of light seemed suspicious, every creak of the house, footsteps. The next day, I decided to explore the second floor more thoroughly. I went up the stairs that creaked ominously under my weight. I examined the rooms. Everything was in its place, covered in dust. I looked for something that could make that sound, an old cabinet that moved, a creaky floorboard. But I didn't find anything obvious. The floor upstairs was indeed old and creaky, but the sound I had heard was different, more monotonous, heavier, as if something was being dragged, not just stepped on. In one of the bedrooms, I found an old wooden chest. It was heavy, locked. I didn't have a key and decided not to break it open yet. Maybe there was something valuable inside, I thought. Over the next few days, the strange things continued to happen. I started noticing that objects in the rooms changed their position, and these weren't minor things. A chair I had moved away from the window was back by it. A painting on the wall that had been straight was now crooked. This couldn't be blamed on inattention anymore. The most disturbing thing was the feeling of being watched. It became almost constant. When I was on the first floor, I felt like someone was watching me from above. When I went up to the second, the feeling shifted downstairs. It was exhausting, constantly being on edge, knowing you weren't alone. Sleep became a real torment. I would wake up in the middle of the night at the slightest noise, my heart racing. The darkness outside the windows seemed alive, full of hidden things. I tried to rationalize everything. Stress, isolation, an old building, too much free time to think. Maybe I was going crazy? This thought was terrifying, but perhaps less terrifying than the alternative. I decided to look for information about the house or Great Aunt Margaret. There was no cell service, but I had a laptop and satellite internet. Slow, but there. I found some local online archives, old newspaper clippings. There wasn't much information about the house. It was built in the late 19th century by some farming family. Then it changed owners several times. There were no mentions of anything unusual or tragic. However, I found a few mentions of Margaret herself. She had lived in that house for most of her life. Neighbors described her as very reclusive, strange. They said she didn't socialize with anyone, lived like a hermit. There were rumors that she had some mental health issues or that she saw or heard things. One old article mentioned that local children were afraid of her house and called it the house on Ghost Hill, although the reasons for this weren't explained. These small details only amplified my anxiety. The house on Ghost Hill. So, I wasn't the only one feeling this. One day, while working on the first floor, I clearly heard footsteps overhead. Slow, measured steps moving along the second floor hallway. Thump thump, thump thump. I froze. These weren't creaks of wood, but definite, heavy footsteps of a person. I grabbed the flashlight and ran upstairs. The stairs creaked beneath me. When I reached the second floor, the sound stopped. The hallway was empty. The rooms were too. No one. I went through all the rooms, looked under beds and closets. No one. The house was empty, except for me. But I heard those steps. I heard them as clearly as the pounding of my own heart. That night, things got even worse. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep. It was dark outside the window, and suddenly I heard whispering. It was an incomprehensible, quiet, but clear whisper coming from behind the wall, like someone was standing very close and saying something in a very low voice. I couldn't make out the words. It was just a collection of sounds that sounded ominous and indistinct. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to hear better. The whispering intensified, becoming more insistent. It seemed to envelop me, penetrate my ears. I felt cold sweat running down my back. "Who's there?" I asked quietly, even though I knew how pointless it was. The whispering stopped. Silence again. But this silence was even scarier than the sounds. It was filled with unspoken threat. I couldn't sleep in that room anymore. I grabbed my sleeping bag and moved to the living room on the first floor by the fireplace. I felt a little safer there, as if the walls were thicker, protecting me. But the whispering seemed to reach me from upstairs anyway, though it was quieter. I sat by the fireplace until morning, without lighting a fire, just staring into the darkness and listening. Every creak, every gust of wind made me flinch. After that night, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. This wasn't fatigue, stress, or madness. There was something here. Something incomprehensible and sinister. I remembered the locked chest on the second floor. I felt like the answers might be there. I found a few tools and decided to break it open. It wasn't easy. The chest was sturdy. The old would resist it. But finally, I managed to pry open the lid. Inside, the chest was filled with old things. Rotting fabric, faded photographs, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, and a notebook. An old, worn leather-bound notebook. I carefully took it out. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting uneven, as if written by a very old person or someone in great distress. It was a diary. My great-aunt Margaret's diary. I started reading. The entries were irregular. Sometimes months passed between them. At first, they were ordinary notes about the weather, household chores. But gradually, the tone changed. Disturbing phrases appeared. They're here again. I hear footsteps upstairs, even though I'm alone in the house. Voices. They whisper my name, trying to say something. It's cold. This cold isn't from the wind. It's coming from inside the walls. Objects move. They're playing with me. They want to prove I'm insane. I felt my own heartbeat match the rhythm of anxiety in her entries. She was experiencing the same thing, but her entries went further. They're getting stronger. I see their shadows in the corners of the rooms. Eyes. I see eyes in the darkness. They're watching me. They don't want me to leave. This place holds them. And now it holds me. Chest. Must hide this. No one must know. The last entries were chaotic, written in a trembling hand. There were mentions of a portal, a threshold, what came from the woods. The entries broke off abruptly. The last words were, "They're calling. I can't resist anymore." I felt the notebook fall from my trembling hands. Everything that was happening to me had happened to her decades earlier. She hadn't gone crazy. She had experienced it. And something had happened to her. "They're calling. I can't resist anymore." What did that mean? She went with them? Disappeared? The thought that I was following in her footsteps, that the same fate awaited me, caused panic. I grabbed my phone, desperately trying to find even one bar of service. Nothing. I was cut off from the world. I sat on the floor, surrounded by Margaret's old things, her diary in my hands, and felt the darkness around me thicken, become almost palpable. The feeling of presence intensified manifold. It was everywhere. It knew I had read the diary. It knew I understood now. After finding the diary, the atmosphere in the house changed. If before it was just a creepy old building with strange phenomena, now it became actively hostile. Objects began to move not just subtly, but before my eyes. A book on the shelf slowly slid off and fell. A door slammed shut with force, making me jump. Dishes in the kitchen rattled as if something invisible was moving them. The whispering became louder and more frequent. Now it didn't just come from behind the walls, but seemed to spread throughout the entire house. It was a chaotic cacophony of incomprehensible phrases, fragments of words, moans, and laughter. Sometimes it seemed like I heard my name, uttered in a cold, unnatural voice. The scariest thing was the shadows. They became more distinct, moving in my peripheral vision. In the corner of the room, behind me, behind doors. When I quickly turned to look, the shadows disappeared, leaving only emptiness. But I knew they were there. They were watching. Sleeping was impossible. I constantly heard sounds, whispers, felt cold touches on my skin, even though no one was nearby. I felt like someone was standing by my bed, breathing on my face, although the darkness prevented me from seeing anything. My condition rapidly deteriorated. Insomnia, constant fear, paranoia. I stopped eating, lost weight. My thoughts were muddled. I started talking to myself, trying to convince myself that none of this was real. But they responded with whispers or moved objects, as if laughing at my attempts at rationalization. I started seeing strange images even when I was awake. Short, fleeting visions, distorted faces in the windows, figures disappearing around a corner, eyes glowing in the dark. The house seemed to come alive. Its walls breathed, its floors groaned, its air was filled with an invisible presence. This was a place where the threshold between reality and something else was incredibly thin. And that threshold was thinning faster and faster. I remembered my great-aunt's words about the portal and what came from the woods. What did she mean? Was there some kind of passage in the house? To some other reality? And what exactly had come? I started searching the house, looking for something unusual. The basement only held old junk and the smell of dampness. The attic, a pile of old things, but nothing suspicious. I returned to the room where I found the chest. Reread the last entries in the diary. They're calling. I can't resist anymore. Where were they calling to? One evening, sitting by the fireplace, I heard something quietly scratching at the front door. Like an animal. I went to the door, carefully looked through the peephole. There was no one there. Just the dark porch and the blackness of the forest beyond. But the scratching repeated. And then I heard a quiet meow. Like a cat. But there were no cats in this wilderness. The meowing became more insistent, turning into a plaintive cry. It sounded incredibly real, filled with pain and pleading. My heart ached with pity. Maybe it was just a lost animal? I slowly reached out my hand towards the bolt. The moment my fingers touched the metal, the meowing suddenly changed. It became deeper, hoarser, utterly unnatural. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a sound filled with malice and something alien. I snatched my hand back abruptly, feeling icy terror paralyze my body. From behind the door came a quiet, wet laugh. It was short, but it pierced me to the bone. I stumbled back from the door, tripped, and fell to the floor. My heart pounded like crazy. They were playing with me. They were trying to lure me outside. I understood that this wasn't just ghosts. This was something else. Something that had a mind, its own intentions. And those intentions were hostile. After the incident with the door, I stopped going near the windows and doors at night. I felt besieged in my own fortress, which, however, no longer seemed so reliable. I spent several days in almost constant terror, eating only what I had, trying to sleep in fits and starts, constantly listening to the sounds of the house. The voices didn't stop. The shadows continued to move. I remembered Margaret's last entry. They're calling. I can't resist anymore. What was this calling? And how did she resist it? I decided to go back to the diary, looking for any clues. I reread it again and again, trying to decipher the chaotic thoughts of the old woman. In one place, between the lines, I noticed a barely visible diagram or drawing. It looked like a circle with some symbols around it and a line leading to the center. Below it was written one word: basement. The basement? I had already searched it, but found nothing. It was just an old, damp basement. With a flashlight in hand, I went down the stairs to the basement. The air there was even heavier and colder, saturated with the smell of earth and mold. The beam of the flashlight slid over brick walls, wooden beams, old boxes. I was looking for something unusual. A crack in the wall, a strange symbol on the floor, something that would resemble the diagram from the diary. I walked around the entire basement several times. Nothing. Just an old, forgotten space. Disappointment mixed with increasing fear. Maybe I had misunderstood the entry? Or was it just the ravings of a madwoman? As I was about to go back upstairs, my flashlight accidentally illuminated a small area of the floor near one of the walls. There, barely visible under a layer of dust, were lines drawn. I knelt down, carefully brushing away the dust. That was it. It was a diagram. Not a perfect circle, but rather an irregular shape with a few lines and symbols similar to those in the diary. It was drawn directly on the cement floor of the basement. And in the center of this diagram was a small, barely noticeable crack. Cold emanated from it, a different cold than the general cold of the basement. It was a bone-chilling cold, as if coming from the abyss itself. I felt the whispering intensify, now coming directly from the crack. It was clearer, more understandable. Although I still couldn't make out the words, I felt its essence, an invitation. An invitation into the darkness. A calling. The same calling Margaret had written about. I felt an irresistible urge to reach out my hand towards the crack, to touch it. As if some invisible force was pulling me. My legs moved on their own. I was kneeling on the floor by the diagram. The cold emanated from the crack, enveloping me. The whispering turned into a multi-voiced choir, sounding directly in my head. These weren't words, but emotions, feelings, emptiness, loneliness, oblivion, but also some distorted, sick peace. I almost touched the crack with my fingers when suddenly an image of Margaret flashed in my mind. Her stern face from the photograph. Her last words in the diary: I can't resist anymore. She succumbed. She went where the portal called. And what happened to her? The force pulling me intensified. I felt something cold and invisible trying to grab my hand, drag me into the crack. Terror gripped me again, but this time it was mixed with determination. I didn't want to repeat her fate. Gathering my last strength, I snatched my hand away from the crack. I crawled back, away from the diagram. The calling intensified, becoming angry, irritated. The whispering turned into an ominous growl coming from the crack. I stood up, not taking my eyes off the diagram. What was this? A portal to what? To some other dimension? Or was it just a place where something was stuck? Something that came from the woods, as Margaret wrote? I understood one thing. I couldn't stay here. Not a minute longer. This house was a trap. A portal. And whatever was on the other side wanted me. I didn't stop to pack. There was no time. The fear was overwhelming. It urged me on. I ran upstairs, grabbed the car keys, my phone, my wallet. I could hear the house protesting. Doors slammed, walls groaned. The whispering was no longer coming only from the basement but from all sides, turning into an angry roar. I ran out onto the porch. The cold night air hit my face. The forest around was black, impenetrable. I ran down the steps, tripped, almost fell. I ran to the car, not looking back. I heard something terrible coming from the house, a mix of screams, growls, crashing sounds. As if the house itself was tearing apart with fury. I started the car. The engine didn't start right away, as if it too was resisting. I turned on the headlights. 2 beams of light cut through the darkness. I pulled away. As the car began to move away from the house, I caught a glimpse of movement on the second floor out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered in one of the windows. Not just a shadow, but something, tall and disjointed, standing behind the glass and looking directly at me. I slammed on the gas. The tires crunched on the gravel. I drove down the bumpy road, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The house stood on top of the hill, dark and menacing. And then I saw it. From the second floor window where I had seen the shadow, a faint, greenish light began to emanate. It pulsed, growing stronger. I sharply turned onto the rural road and floored the gas pedal. The car sped into the darkness, and I watched in the mirror as the glow from the house on the hill grew brighter, spreading to other windows. As if the house itself was igniting from within with this strange, unnatural light. I didn't stop until I reached the first signs of civilization, a small gas station near the highway. There, under the lights, I stopped, turned off the engine, and rested my head on the steering wheel. I was shaking. Every muscle ached from tension. I sat in the car, staring into the void, until dawn began to break. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. They were so welcome, so real. I got out of the car, feeling utterly exhausted. I looked back towards the hill I had come from. In the distance, I could see trees, the hill, and nothing else. No sign of the house, no glow. Maybe it was a dream? A terrible nightmare caused by fatigue and stress? But I knew it wasn't. Too many details, too real sensations. Too genuine fear. I took out my phone. Surprisingly, there was one bar of service. I dialed the first number that came to mind, a friend in the city. Hey. Yeah, it's me, Alex. My voice was hoarse and weak. I need help. I was at that house. I never went back to that hill. Never found out what happened to the house or what was hiding within its walls. Margaret's diary remained in the car. I kept it as proof, as a reminder. What I experienced changed me forever. I know there are things we cannot understand, things that exist on the threshold of our reality. And sometimes those things can cross that threshold. Was that portal still active? Is what called Margaret still there, in the darkness of the basement, waiting for the next victim? I don't know. And frankly, I don't want to know. I just try to live on, with that knowledge, with that fear that never completely leaves me. And when night falls, and the darkness outside the window becomes too thick, I sometimes hear the quiet whisper of the wind. Or is it something else? Something that reminds me of the house on Ghost Hill.